the video, and then I do use a separate platform for audio for quality. And if you're ready, in three, two, one. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sandy K Nutrition, Health and Lifestyle Queen. Today with me, I have a special guest, and her name is Dr. Sarah Ballantyne. She is a PhD and she is the founder of Nutrivore.com. She's also a New York Times best-selling author, and it's of the Nutrivore book. And I have been diving deep into this book. It is the radical new science for getting the nutrients you need from the food you eat. She creates educational resources to help people improve their day to day diet and lifestyle choices, empowered and informed by the most current evidence based scientific research. With Nutrivore, Dr. Sarah has created a positive and inclusive approach to dietary guidance based on science and devoid of dogma, using nutrient density and sufficiency as its basic principles. Nourishment, not judgment. And today we're going to talk about how we can eat to support longevity and health span, which we all know we want health span over just longevity. And we want to remain fit without going on a diet. And this book speaks to me because I was actually saying recently in my Instagram stories, probably one of the most balanced books on nutrition I have ever read. And I kind of come from a place of restriction, people. Most of you know this who follows me. Um, I've had some ups and downs, and I've kind of seen the path to balance. I even have a t-shirt that I made. It's all about the balance. And Dr. Sarah, I love what you're doing, and I'm just so excited for this conversation. I welcome you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited too.
So, of course, I have to ask you your background. Why so passionate in this field?
So, my professional journey I consider myself a science communicator in health and nutrition topics. You can't kind of separate that professional drive to this career from from my personal experiences. They really kind of fed into each other. So I grew up a really sickly kid. I had strep throat 10 times a year. I had, mono for 6 months when I was 7. I had symptoms of hypothyroidism that started with puberty and wasn't diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis until I was 37. I started struggling with my weight. I was obese by the time I was 14. And one of the things that sort of happened was, I mean, first of all, being exhausted all the time kind of kept me out of trouble. So there's a piece of this that probably helped me succeed in school because I went to bed at 8:30 at night because I couldn't stay awake anymore. So there was no sneaking out of the house for me. So there's a piece of growing up with undiagnosed autoimmune disease that I'm very grateful for because I think it taught me a lot of skills that I rely on today. That sort of like pushing through and staying focused. Sort of learned through feeling crummy and sort of still working really hard through feeling physically terrible. Um, that's kind of translated into an extreme work ethic today. Um, but yeah, I went to school for medical biophysics as my PhD. I did medical research, and I was all the while collecting diagnoses like some other people collect purses, which
Oh,
I would argue is much more fun than collecting new long medical terms to apply to myself. And I was struggling. I was very overweight. Um, and had everything. It was just this laundry list of things that I was struggling with. And so when my first daughter was born, I decided I can't balance this. I can't do this like academic career in medical research and being an engaged mom to a colicky baby, I'm not healthy enough. Um, I was exhausted all the time, and when you just, throw on all of the challenges of new motherhood on top of it, I wasn't healthy enough to do both. So I ended up taking time off of my academic career, and that was an interesting double-edged sword because it gave me the space to start working on some diet and lifestyle changes that made a really big difference in my own health. But at the time, I was also um, having battled weight issues for such a large portion of my life. I was very susceptible to diet culture messaging and to food fear and restrictive dieting. And so my entry into the wellness community was through restrictive dieting. Like that is how I developed a platform. That's how I became a prominent voice in the wellness community, was through promoting restrictive dieting. And kind of what brought me back to a evidence-based approach was hitting that wall in terms of health again. Um, the really uncomfortable realization that I thought I had healed from an eating disorder I developed in my teens, but really I had just traded it for a different eating disorder, and a learned one at that, right? I had learned all of this fear around food, um, that I couldn't find the scientific rationale for. And so as I was um, working on actually a book on the gut microbiome and learning about what foods and nutrients and hormones and lifestyle factors are really important for affecting the composition of the gut microbiome, I started to like be challenged with paper after paper that was like, hey, here's this food that you're scared of that you are not eating, yeah, as part of your restrictive diet. That's really, really important for gut microbiome, diversity, composition, metabolic activity. And I realized that I had bought into a lot of misinformation, a lot of pseudoscience, that I had learned some incorrect ways of thinking about foods from other scientists, other doctors who I trusted. And that caused a big shift in how I think, right? There was a little bit of a feeling of being gullible, I think. Um, and then I decided that this was a really important uh, learning experience, right? Because there's so much misinformation about nutrition online, probably more misinformation than there is good information. And if someone with a PhD in medical biophysics who is doing medical research can fall for it, everyone can fall for it.
Mhm.
And so part of creating Nutrivore is about sort of finding my way back to evidence-based nutrition recommendations, but also reflecting the psychology of that experience, right? So the harm of restrictive dieting, how restrictive dieting really drives uh, the sort of on again, off again diet roller coaster, how it actually increases susceptibility to developing disordered eating patterns and eating disorders. And it doesn't actually help us form lifelong eating habits. And everything I've sort of learned in this process of reteaching myself a bunch of things that I thought I knew about nutrition is all integrated into how I communicate Nutrivore. So Nutrivore is just the goal of getting all of the nutrients our bodies need from the foods we eat. But because most of us don't know what that looks like, right? We can't intuit a nutrient dense diet. Maybe we once could, but we've all gone on so many different diets over the years that we don't know what a nutrient dense
Mm.
balanced diet looks like anymore. It was just checking to make sure that wasn't a hand up. Um, and so I think that so Nutrivore is as much about teaching people the nutritional sciences education to not just like inform day-to-day choices so we can choose more nutrient-dense foods, but it's also about putting an end to diet culture, putting an end to the nutrition misinformation that is harming people's health by teaching them to fear health promoting foods.
Well, what you speak about really God, it aligns with me so much because I come from this world and I'm not slamming anybody because everybody has a right to, you know, pick their side, right? They
Yeah,
could everybody has that right. And often what I find, because I will research things and I will look into things and then I'm like, okay, when I hear statements that are blanket statements made by people with a very large influence, like kale will kill you.
right.
Okay. For me, before I'd be like, oh my God, kale's going to kill me. Oh my God, why? Oh, oh, maybe I shouldn't eat kale. So this is my mindset. Whereas I'm like, well, wait a minute. If I cook that kale, it's actually really nutrient dense. And if I don't eat that kale constantly and I eat it in balance with all other foods that are whole, real foods, it's okay. And then same thing with beans. Oh my God, don't eat beans, lectins. And I'm like, well, my mother grew up on beans. She's 78 years old. They come from farming. They're farming people, old country Croatia.
Yeah,
So I'm like, she's done all right. So,
right.
you know what I'm saying? So I have really stepped away from a lot of those blanket statements. I have made those errors myself where I'm like, you know, oh, I'm keto. I'm all about the keto. And then I realized that it was such deprivation that I started baking every single day, Sarah, with these non-caloric sweeteners that were literally twisting my gut into knots. And there goes that balance again.
Yeah.
So, this is why I think what you're doing is so important. It's such important work because we live in this space of social media where we're getting hit with all this advice constantly.
And very, I think, I want to emphasize the point you just made that it's very black and white, right? So it's very miracle food and toxic food, right? Like we don't really have language on the internet that describes food as anything other than these two extremes. But to expand a little bit on the fear, right? The kale will kill you. The oats, are the worst thing ever. Beans and their lectins. Because you know, I completely bought into a large portion of that. It's an interesting argument and one that I think is worthwhile kind of expanding because the argument for the oxalates in kale or the phytates in oats or the lectins in lentils as being problematic comes from animal model studies or cell culture studies. So it's like cells in a test tube in a petri dish, where they take the isolated compounds and typically look at like one disease state, right? So we'll look at one very specific biochemical pathway. And one of the things that those studies don't tell us is they don't tell us how the whole food affects the whole body.
Mm.
And it's really easy to see, right? And especially as somebody who came from academic research, was doing those types of mechanistic studies in the lab, I would look at these, fascinating studies at a, mouse model of colitis, and and you give them, the lectins from kidney beans, and oh, look, it increases these inflammatory markers, right? Like that to me was a really convincing argument. But the fact is, we are incredibly biologically complex. There's 49 essential nutrients, hundreds or thousands of other important nutrients that are technically non-essential, but we're still healthier when we consume them. And foods are fantastically complex. They're not just one compound. So those same foods have a variety of other nutritive compounds that are supporting those same biological systems. And so it's really important to look at not what one compound does to one system, but what the whole food does for the whole us. And that's the shift in my thinking that I've made over the last 6, 7 years is not looking, I mean, looking at completely different types of studies. So instead of looking first to the animal model studies and the cell culture studies, looking at the intervention studies where they have one group of people eat this food and another group of people not, or the large population studies. And then you look at the mechanistic studies to understand like how does this explain a phenomenon we see in humans? But you have to test whether or not that phenomenon exists in humans. And the fact is, for all of these foods for which there's so much food fear on the internet, is when you give people those foods, they get healthier. They don't they don't get more inflamed. They don't get more diabetes. They don't get more cardiovascular disease. They get less. And that's because all of those foods are packed with other things than the one thing we're being told to be afraid of, the oxalates, the phytates, the lectins. And so it's, I think, part of how these myths take hold online is because we don't get taught basic nutritional sciences in school. But if we did, if we graduated high school with just a base knowledge, right? The same kind of amount of knowledge about nutrition that we have about grammar, right? Or algebra, we would be able to see that and go, okay, yeah, but kale also has tons of vitamin C and vitamin K. It's got some folate and some biotin. It's got lots of really important fiber. It's got this super cool class of phytonutrients called glucosinolates that reduce risk of cancer and cardiovascular disease and neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's. So, what is the balance between all of those important nutrients and oxalates? Who needs to worry about oxalates, right? It's people with inflammatory bowel disease, with a 1 in 3 million frequency genetic predisposition to oxalate metabolism disorders. And it's people with chronic dehydration who are prone to kidney
Kidney
stones,
stones.
right? So let's look at the context, right? The context is, yeah, there's a group of people who do need to worry about dietary oxalates. For the vast majority of us, our body's really good at controlling oxalate metabolism. We control how much we absorb from our digestive tract. We control what happens to it, where it goes. Most of the oxalates in our body are ones that our bodies make, not what comes from our food. And so like, that biology knowledge, because we don't have it, it's so easy to see this argument that's focused on this like really narrow one biochemical pathway and go, yeah, oh, look at the papers that support that argument. Yeah, this must be true. Now I have to be terrified of kale. And it's why I care so much about creating that knowledge base for people to be able to not just understand like what nutrients do in the body, what types of foods have what types of nutrients, the relative proportion of those foods to eat to get the full range of nutrients that we need, right? What are the small changes I can make in my food choice to get more nutrition? But like also, what is the knowledge base I need to be able to see that argument online and go, that can't be right? Like whether or not I understand all of the different biological pathways, that I don't need to be able to understand all the details. I just need to have a big enough base of knowledge to be able to go, I feel skeptical about that. That doesn't feel right. I'm going to look that up, or I know the person I'm going to ask the more detailed question to be able to understand that. Because right now, most people don't have that depth of knowledge to be able to say, okay, but most of the oxalates in your body are the ones that you make, right? We just
Yeah.
hear oxalates, kidney
Mm.
stones, or oxalates, crystallization in our joint pain, right? We just hear these arguments and it sounds scary. And uh, and most people are looking for a reason to not eat kale. So it works, right? Like, tell me to be afraid of a bitter food. Okay. Um, and I think it's you can see that in all of the resources that I create is my sort of path through believing a lot of that misinformation really informs how I talk about food. So I talk about food very positively, but I can't tell you about the benefits of kale without busting the myths about kale that are out there as well. So I really have to try to integrate. Yes, look at all these great things that kale has, but also, yeah, don't worry about the oxalates unless you're one of these people, right? Like
Right.
bringing that context and nuance to the conversation as well, so we can get out of black and white and start talking about where everything actually is, which is in the amazing world of gray in the middle.
I love that you mentioned the whole critical thinking aspect because I think people are too quick to just say, oh, I can't eat this, as opposed to just going back and going, let me look into this and see why this person said this. And I love that. And then I have to mention, I'll never forget when my kids were in high school and they came home, and it was almost like you'll laugh, their way of rebelling against their
Mm,
nutritionist mother is to come home and say, oh, we learned in school today that meat is bad and that Beyond Beef burgers are better for you, and that you are not supposed to eat any saturated fats ever. So they'll come home and they'll tell me these things that they actually are being taught in school.
yeah.
And so
Yeah, I mean, they get a 1 week nutrition module as part of their 6 week health course once in high school. And yeah, I don't think that they're taught they're still taught moralization of food, right? They're still taught this food good, that food bad. And that's not how diets work. That's not how that's not how nutrition works, right? So there's no such thing as a bad food. There's such thing as too much of a specific food, right?
yeah,
But we have to understand the composition of the whole diet and what is the role that that food plays in the whole diet, and that requires thinking about foods in a more complex way. So thinking about foods, I think about foods as giving us one of three things. So one is energy, right? So calories, protein, carbohydrates, fats, right? So the energy that we need, right? We have all these chemical reactions that are required in our body for our bodies to do things that wouldn't happen if you just put all the chemicals in a bowl together, right? So if you just put those chemicals in a bowl, that chemical reaction won't happen. In order to make that chemical reaction happen in our bodies, we need enzymes to put those chemicals together and make that chemical reaction happen. And that necessarily requires energy. So we put energy into the system to make these chemical reactions happen that are chemical reactions that need to happen for us to be us. So energy is still really important. We don't want to just be like, oh, calories bad. The other thing is nutrients, right? So vitamins, minerals, essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, phytonutrients like polyphenols. So these are building blocks. So they're all of the things that make us us, but they're also those chemicals, right? They're the raw materials that go into those chemical reactions. They're also what the enzymes are made of, right? That are making the chemical reaction happen. They're cofactors, right? That might be also required for that chemical reaction. So energy for the chemical reactions, the raw materials for the chemical reactions, and then something that's not at all related to that at all, which is experience, joy, right?
yeah,
It is the psychology of eating rather than the physiology of eating. As humans, we celebrate with food. We nurture other people with food. We nurture ourselves with food. We find comfort in food. We find solace in food. We find friendship sometimes in food, right? We bond over food. We mourn with food. Um, we find community with food. And that is something that is missing from every healthy diet conversation, which is that food has this other role to play in the human experience that is not just energy and nutrients. And some foods have all three, right? Some foods have energy, nutrients, and supply us with important experience, joy, right? Flavor, taste. And some foods have two or one, right? Out
yeah,
of those three things. But I think that it's really important when we're talking about long-term health outcomes, right? So reducing your risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, chronic kidney disease, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, right? Increasing health span, right? So we have those healthy years for the rest of our lives, right? If we're talking about that being the goal, we want to be getting all of those nutrients, right? All of those raw materials that we need to be able to support all of our biological systems. We want to be getting us enough energy for those systems to be able to do their work without exceeding our energy requirements. But if we're not enjoying the experience of that diet, if we're not enjoying the flavor of our foods, if we're not still getting comfort and solace and joy and laughter and celebration from the foods that we're eating, we're not going to be able to stick with those healthy eating patterns, right? It doesn't matter how healthy a diet I craft for you. If you don't like the flavors you're eating, you're not going to stick to it.
Yeah.
If you're thinking about that way of eating in terms of restriction, if you're thinking about the foods you're missing, you're not going to be able to stick to it. It has to be permissive. It has to necessarily make room for those foods that hit all of those, comfort and joy buttons. Like those are really important tools to be able to get enough joy from an overall healthy diet so that you can stick to it for the long term. Because if you can't stick to it, it's not going to do its job of reducing risk of long-term health problems. It has to be sustainable. And to be sustainable, it has to be tasty. It has to fit our budget. It has to fit um, our like time and energy requirements to prepare food, right? It has to meet our flavor preferences. And so that is as much, has to be as much part of the conversation about how to make healthy eating a lifelong healthy habit as much as why, kale is good and why we don't need to be afraid of oats, right? Like it also has to be you're allowed to eat tasty foods. I think that's the worst
Yeah.
message from diet culture is that somehow if you're liking it, it doesn't count, right? Like that's the earliest thing I can remember about diets, like plain carrot and celery sticks, right? You're not allowed to dip it because that dip has, I'm old enough that my introduction to diet culture was still like the low fat craze of the 70s and 80s. So back then, it's like, oh, ranch dressing, just terrible, right? Like that was kind of the prevailing message. Yeah, I think it's a really important tool for sustainable nutrition to give ourselves permission to both prepare foods in a way that we enjoy, but also make room for foods that don't necessarily have a ton of nutrition, but are the foods that um, give us joy.
Yeah. I love that. I think you'll love this story. When my husband and I, we were in Split just a couple weeks ago, Croatia. The waitress came to us. This was our first night in Split, and she said, and I said, okay, well, we'll have the fish because when you're on the Adriatic coast,
Yeah.
you want fish, right? So she asked us, okay, do you have a big appetite, medium, what size of fish? You get to pick your fish. She comes with the tray and she starts talking. She tells us a story as she's cutting up the fish in front of us. And she's telling
Wow.
us it was so beautiful. And there was vegetables. Excuse me. There were vegetables. There were potatoes. And there was this beautiful fish. She's telling us this story. And my husband and I were so engaged. And that was the most beautiful meal. It tasted incredible. The energy around that meal and her storytelling of when she was a child growing up along the Adriatic and she would help her father with fishing. And so this is where that joy comes in. And honestly, I think all that energy surrounding that meal made it so nourishing
Yeah.
for us and memorable. And I didn't care about the calories. And I didn't
Yeah.
care about, oh, what was on it or how was it cooked? Or, oh my gosh, I can't eat potatoes. It's too high in carbs. None of that was in my head at all.
There was an interesting study done a few years ago where they had, I think, 5 or 6 different college cafeterias where they went in and they tested 3 different conditions for vegetable dishes. So one was like a really neutral description, right? Green beans. Second was a health focused description, right? Healthy green beans, right? Health promoting, whatever, green beans. And the third was a description focused on the flavor, right? Szechuan green beans with roasted garlic.
Mm.
The green beans were prepared the same way each time. But when they gave a description that was focused on flavor, and they tried this with a bunch of different vegetable dishes, people served themselves larger portions of this veg. That's kind of not a surprise, right? Like, oh, that's going to be tastier. I'm going to give myself more. But what they also showed was that people ate more. So there, we've got some interesting psychology where when we prime ourselves for this is going to be a great flavor experience, oh, that these green beans sound like they're going to be so good. they are better, right? We do like them more. We do eat more of them. And I think that when we're looking at making diet changes, whether that's getting over food fear to expand our diet, maybe from something that we've been restricting unnecessarily. There's obviously
Yeah.
restriction for medical reasons. That's a different bucket. But restricting something that we don't need to because we've been taught food fear about that food on the internet, or whether we're looking to like change the patterns, right? So I'm used to eating a meal that's like meat and potatoes. Now I'm trying to figure out how to add vegetables to that meal, right? And it's not my normal eating pattern. I grew up eating meat and potatoes. Now I'm trying to eat meat, potatoes, and vegetables. And this feels hard, right? I'm not used to cooking these. I'm not used to eating them. They feel really intimidating. Like I only know three vegetables and that, but there's actually 80 different ones for me to choose from the grocery store. It feels overwhelming. I think leveraging that psychology, the storytelling, I mean, just like watching the colors, right, of the vegetables being prepared. And like doing that, I don't know, even if it's just giving things a jazzy name, right? So that we're expecting a great flavor experience while we're preparing that dish. I think it's such an important um aspect of the psychology of diet to be able to leverage to make change sustainable. I mean, that just expecting something to taste good when it looks delicious, it actually will be more
Yeah.
delicious. Like it's a really interesting sort of manifestation of the expectation.
I agree. I agree. I come from that, as you know, that place where this is bad, this is good. And I find, and I know this isn't a conversation about weight, but I find when there's a lot of heaviness around a meal, and by heaviness, I'm speaking about, oh crap, if I eat this, I'm going to gain weight. Or if I eat this, and I know you could probably relate to what I'm speaking
Oh,
of because
yeah.
I've been there.
I've
I
been there
do.
three times actually.
Yeah. And I and
I've
I
had to lose, yeah, I've had to lose 100 pounds or more three times. So, yes, I've been there many times.
So it's interesting because I am very much always about N of one. How does this affect me? How does this? And when I'm in that mindset, I gain weight, Sarah. I gain weight. When I start, it's like that spiraling in my brain, like, oh my
Mm.
God, I put on some weight. And oh my God, I'm worried about eating this. And then I'm like, crap, like I just keep gaining. So I think, there's many aspects to eating healthy. It's that
Yeah,
psychological, it's that not having that fear around the food, it's eating a variety of different foods to
yeah.
support our wellness. So I don't know. I just think there's got to be some change.
Yeah, I so to again sort of expand on what you just said, I think that we're typically sold diets as weight loss solutions, right? That's how most diets are structured. That's the promise of them. That is, we're constantly being bombarded by society, being told we're supposed to look a certain way, and that if we don't, it's because of some kind of character flaw, right? I'm not disciplined enough. I'm not strong enough. I don't have enough willpower to be able to do this thing. And the fact is that weight loss diets doom you to failure, right? Like they're designed for you to fail. That's what the entire $140 billion a year diet and weight loss industry um, requires, right? Like uh, that industry can only exist because you will fail and you will think that it's your fault, right? You will think that you were the problem, not that the diet was the problem. And there's a couple of things happening there. So one, exactly what you were just talking about, which is just measuring, monitoring, right? Just counting calories or whatever else you're being told to count increases the stress response. And that stress response impacts digestion efficacy. It impacts our satiety, our hunger hormones, our cravings, our ability to um, like it literally affects our food choice, right? Like it'll make us more drawn to junk food, less drawn to things like fruits and vegetables. So there's a piece of it that's just like the stress response. Then there's the psychology piece of restrictive dieting. So when you have that like black and white thinking when it comes to food, this food is good, this food is bad. When you have a selection of foods that you are reducing or avoiding completely, that increases food fixation, food obsession. It increases cravings. It makes us more susceptible to emotional eating, and it increases our chances of developing eating disorders. And what happens is you've got this one side, right, where the cravings are getting worse and worse. And then because most of these diets are focused on weight loss and not health, doesn't mean you can't get healthy on these diets, but healthy and thin are not the same. It's not the same words. They'd mean different things. And often we're trading health for weight loss, not gaining health because of weight loss, right? So when you have a too high energy deficit, which most of these diets promote, because that's how you get your 10 pounds in the first week sales promise, is that causes a couple of physiological adaptations. So one is increase in the hunger hormone ghrelin. So
Mm.
you feel hungrier between meals and less satisfied after you eat. And another one is a drop in metabolism, and that's both through a lowering of the basal metabolic rate, uh, directly through suppressing our thyroid. But the other one is a really interesting adaptation, which is a decrease in non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So literally, we fidget less when we're eating fewer calories. We will start to find ourselves less motivated to run up the stairs to grab something, right? It's like, no, I'll get it later. Or we'll see a mess on the floor and we're like, ugh, I don't have the energy to clean that right now. Um, we basically burn fewer calories through all of the movement that we do throughout the day that's not exercise. And it's our body's way of like conserving energy, right? There's not enough calories to go around. Our bodies are going to fight it, right? We're trying to survive a famine, right? That's what our bodies think's happening. But if you combine increased hunger, this like weird, like, I mean, a lowered metabolism doesn't feel good, right? You feel tired and sluggish. That's going to feed into cravings as well, right? When you feel tired, you're like, where's my sugar? Where's my pick me up?
Yep.
Right? Where's my thing? And then you've got obsession and fixation and cravings for the foods that you've restricted. There's no person in the world who can do that a long term, right? That is that is exactly the recipe for, okay, fine, I will give in. Or maybe it didn't even feel like a choice, right? Maybe it just like all of a sudden, wow, that's three slices of pizza in. Maybe it's I'm traveling or something extra stressful happened, right? And we triggered that emotional eating. We hit that moment of what's technically called disinhibition, right? It's the technical term for falling off of the proverbial wagon. And then it feels like nothing's in our control, right? All of our behaviors are unraveling. And diets do that on purpose. That's how every diet is designed. It's sold to you as a weight loss solution, but really it's going to drive the yo-yo. It's why maintaining lost weight is so challenging. And it's just this is, I mean, 50, 60, 70 years of us being sold that we're the problem.
Mm.
Meanwhile, this industry just keeps growing. So we'll buy the next diet, the next book, the next supplement regime, right? The next whatever program. And that is if I can change anything about how we talk about food, that's it. That's right there. Right there, because there's lots of eating patterns that we can adopt that will cause our and lifestyle factors that will cause our bodies to normalize to a metabolically healthy size.
Mm-hmm.
And things like eating more vegetables, right? Making sure we're getting good quality protein foods that can be lean meats, it can be seafood, it can be plant proteins, right? Eating more plant foods than animal foods, getting those healthy fats, right? Like those eating patterns, more whole foods, right? Foods that take more time to chew are more satiating. Higher fiber foods, higher protein foods are more satiating, right? Balanced meals where we're getting all of our macros, those are more satiating. That optimizes digestion. We can like make those changes along with active lifestyle, getting enough sleep, reducing stress, right? Getting vitamin D levels in check. Like there's lots of other like little tidbits that instead of trading our health for weight loss, are lifelong healthy habits that will improve our health, improve our longevity and our health span, and typically help us achieve a metabolically healthy body size. That doesn't necessarily mean it's like the same number as society is telling me that I need to be, right? Because
Yep.
I don't think a lot of us have I don't think we have the what a healthy body looks like in our head when we're thinking about what we want. I think we often have underweight in our head as what we think we want because that has been the beauty standard for so long. But that is right, that like it's almost no, it's I mean, it's really like giving up dieting as the path to finally reaching our health goals. And it's why I think, I mean, I really try to communicate Nutrivore concepts in a weight inclusive way because of just how toxic and triggering this messaging around weight loss diets are for so many people. Um, but I think that's the most important thing we can do in this conversation is say, this is why restriction's bad. This is why food fear is bad. It's actually going to make it harder for you to reach your long-term health goals and your short-term health goals for that matter than simply viewing foods positively, understanding, what a balanced plate looks like and what the different foods are that are going to supply the different nutrients, and then still finding the joy in food. Like that is the path to getting off of that diet roller coaster.
Do you know who Dr. Richard Johnson is? I don't know if you
No,
know
I
who
do
he is.
not.
Okay, so he is, I'm going to mess up. I don't know his exact title, but we recorded a couple of podcasts about sugar,
Hmm.
and that's his specialty is sugar. And it was so fascinating to me because him and I were talking about longevity. And he said to me, the research shows that when you have a slightly higher BMI versus frail and in this perfect BMI, you actually have better longevity than the
Yeah.
person who's frail. And so I think he was speaking not obese. He was saying, BMI of 27, 27 and a half. And that's what the research is showing. So I find it really interesting because I know a lot of people who are, this perfect body, this perfect BMI. And by the way, I personally don't really subscribe to the whole BMI thing. I think
Yeah.
there's too much missing from that BMI. However, I would like to get a little bit into this restriction around menopause.
Mm.
So, women, and I'm definitely, I've done this. It's like I'm chasing my old body, chasing
Yeah.
my old self. I'm very short. I'm only 5'2", and throughout the majority of life, 115, I've been down to 100 pounds. Like I'm a little person. Then I hit perimenopause and lose my thyroid at the same time. So after having two kids, so I'm like, yeah, like I don't even know who I am. But that's my story on, and I think I had definite, body issues way before that.
Hmm.
I've read journals and I'm like, I know I've had
Yeah.
issues. But my point is, everyone says that once you reach around midlife and a little older, it's harder to absorb. We develop other issues like maybe low stomach acid, so it's harder to get those minerals and extract the minerals from the food. And so then on top of it, you're seeing a lot of restriction because these women are saying, "Oh, I want to have my 35-year-old body back." So I would love to hear your take on all of that.
Yeah. So, um, exactly the research that you quoted, there's actually a fairly large body of scientific literature showing that being a little bit heavier than what is the conventional norms, is the most protective. And so that's typically like the overweight BMI category. But somewhere in the like higher end of normal range
Yes.
to middle of the overweight range
Yeah.
is sort of optimal. And that's for most people 15 to 20 pounds higher than their goal weights, right? Like 30 pounds higher than their goal weight is kind of the way to think about it as being optimal. And that's because the there's a lot of regulation that happens with our energy stores, right? So our energy stores are also endocrine organs, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of systems that actually are impacted by the hormones that our fat stores are producing. And so we don't necessarily want to minimize that, right? Like our bodies are very much designed to be in a happy medium. And there's some really interesting research showing that, especially for menopausal females, that being a little bit heavier reduces risk of cancer, which is fascinating and also, I think, very interesting. But we also want to make sure that we're building muscle mass, right? So, like, especially going in, if you can, I might not, if, whatever period of time we're in, but if you still have time to go into perimenopause with higher muscle mass, that is preferable. Simply because females on average lose 10% of their muscle just during the perimenopausal period. And then everyone basically by age 60 has increased loss of muscle mass. It becomes harder and harder to put on muscle. And that increases risk of frailty, that increases risk of falling. And if you combine that with also loss of bone mineral density as we age, which is another thing that's happening in perimenopause and menopause, but another thing that's happening for everyone over about the age of 60. So if you've got the lower muscle, lower bone, and you've got, right, you're developing balance challenges, right? If that is increasing the chances of falling and breaking a hip is the the big like concern, right? That is dramatically erodes quality of life, shortens lifespan, and also is a huge financial burden for people. Um, the nutrients that are really important for preventing all of that, protein is the most important nutrient for maintaining muscle mass. um, Vitamin D, making sure vitamin D levels are tested, and if they're not normal, either finding the food sources of vitamin D, there's not a ton of them. So supplementing is probably what most people are going to need to do to get their vitamin D levels in the normal range. Vitamin K is really important for how our bodies use calcium and where it goes. And then calcium is going to be really important here as well. And those are going to be the nutrients that are going to help improve bone density, muscle mass. But the bigger question here is when you are reaching for a body ideal in this period of time, when it's already hard to put on muscle, when maintaining muscle is one of the most important things that we can do to maintain quality of life as we age. um, when the vitamin and mineral dense foods become the foods that we're more likely to cut out. Um, it's pretty hard to lose weight and not lose lean mass.
Hmm.
Typically, when you're losing weight, you're losing both fat mass and lean mass. It's one of the reasons why yo-yo dieting is so harmful. Um, there's a bunch of studies also that show that people who have gone through, they technically call them weight regain cycles, but it's the technical term for the yo-yo, that they have higher health risks than if they had simply stayed obese, for example. Because what happens with every one of those cycles is you lose fat mass and lean mass. Muscle is a lot harder to put on, right? It requires eating enough protein. It requires being active. It requires, right, even doing like strength training type activities to put that muscle back on. And typically it's easier, especially in a energy surplus from our diet, it's easier to just put on the energy storage, right? Rather than the muscle mass. So each time you go through one of those cycles, you are losing muscle and fat. And then when you go on the upward trajectory of the yo-yo, you typically put back on more fat than muscle, and that shifts body composition towards a less metabolically healthy body with each cycle. That's even more true as we age because our hormone environment now is making it even harder to put on muscle. So we're going to lose more muscle if we're working to lose weight, and we're going to have a harder time putting it back on the other side. And so I think it's why I really think if we can just change the whole conversation from weight to health, right? We can focus on eating more protein, right? Getting those calcium-rich foods, those leafy greens for the vitamin K, making sure vitamin D levels in check, right? Those nutrients that are really important for supporting musculoskeletal health through aging, which is one of the most important systems to support for like function, right? So that you don't need help to go to the bathroom, right? Like th things that I think maybe we're not thinking about as early enough, but it's something that I really care about. Like I want to maintain my independence for as long as I possibly can. Um, we can shift those food choices to make sure that we're getting those nutrients to support those systems, focus on the activity. The recommendations are 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity per week. That can be a brisk walk. It doesn't have to be, going for a run or playing tennis. It can be pickleball. Um, but also strength training twice a week and balance training twice a week.
Hmm.
And those things become even more important as we age to maintain strength and maintain balance. And then I would argue that matters a whole lot more than whether or not I fit into the same pair of jeans I did in my 20s, right? But also that focus on health. What's really cool is studies show it's never too late to get a health span and longevity boost from making healthy diet and lifestyle changes. Um, there was one study, it was sort of a theoretical one, so it was like doing these calculations, but showed that if you had a perfect diet and lifestyle at age 20, males could add 13 years to their lifespan and females could add 11 years. But if you made those same changes at age 60, you could still add 8 years to the
Hmm.
lifespan. And if you
Oh,
made those same changes at age 80, you could still add nearly 3.5 years to the lifespan. So it's like
oh,
really never too late to make those changes. Those are the changes that are focused on health, not the changes that are focused on weight, right? Those are the changes that are like, hey, at this age, I care a lot more about maintaining my ability to, sit down on the floor and get back up again than I care about what size jeans I'm wearing. And I think, the more we can have that conversation about what we're trading, what is the trade? Okay, wait a minute. I'm going to go for function. I'm going to go for like what my body can do as a 80, 90, maybe 100-year-old if I'm lucky, right? Like that is what matters to me. And also it's okay if that's not what matters to you. If you have other priorities, that's also fine. But like let's have the full conversation so that we're understanding what the choice is here.
I love it. No, I love it. Now, I have to ask you, what do you think about all the research on the blue zones?
Mm,
I would love to hear your opinion because I know having a father that's 87 and a mother that's 78 who still live in their own home. They still shovel their driveway. They go for walks every single day. My mom does her resistance bands. She does, like she does all of that. But I look at a lot. I learn so much. You know how it is when you're like 20 and you're like, whatever. They don't know anything. They don't know what they're talking about.
yeah.
And then and then now I really ask so many questions, Mom, like how did you live and what did you eat? And she tells me stories about how they would preserve apples from their farm, and they would dig a hole in the ground, and then they would cover it with hay and then like dirt or what, they had all these methods. Like they were quite smart. And so I also look at the blue zones and I think, wow, now that's not just longevity, but health span too.
Yeah.
It's all about the communities. I would love to hear your opinion on how. I know they're different zones and it depends on climate, and I understand that, but I would love to hear your take on it.
So I think it's very instructive, right? But I do think we need to be looking at it holistically because it's not just diet patterns. So we can look at, what they have in common diet-wise is lots of plant foods, typically lots of seafood, right? So there's only one group out of all of the blue zones that's vegetarian, um, and a whole foods diet. So moderate sugar, right? Just because the more whole foods you eat, typically those things are easy to moderate, but also a lifestyle in sync with the sun. They get more sleep than we do. And they tend to be early to bed, early to rise, which, provided that aligns with your chronotype, which it does for most people, is a much healthier pattern. There's studies showing that um, just having high variability in what time you go to bed increases risk of metabolic problems. Um, they're also more active, but not exercise, right? So they move more, um, but they're not necessarily doing a lot of, they're not going to the gym, right, and pumping iron. They're not going for a run, but they're walking a lot. They're doing a lot of um, that type of, right, gardening that's, quite intense labor,
Yeah,
right? Like,
that's that in and of itself, Sarah. Like this year, I'm like, I'm gonna do this all myself. And I was carrying all of the soil bags, and I'm like, there's my strength training. I
yep.
don't need like, and then
Oh,
you're gonna
and it's
laugh at
fun
this.
too.
Yes, it is.
I
And
cannot think of a happier, like my happy place is digging a hole.
yes, I love
There's
it.
nothing better in life.
Okay, you might think this is a little too far because nowadays everybody has somebody clean their house. But I'm like, nope, I'm cleaning my own house. And I started because I'm also very meticulous and I was never really happy. So I'm like, why am I doing this? I'm going to just do it when I feel like I want to do it. And somehow I'm like, that's hard work. I have to
Yeah,
lug
I
around a
think
vacuum.
I mean, it'd be interesting to look up the metabolic equivalent tasks of house cleaning, but I bet it's in the same range as a brisk walk. Like and gardening gets even higher typically, depending on exactly what you're doing.
Yeah,
A lot of these types of, well, chores, we'll call them chores,
chores.
are fantastic activity. And a lot of them will build like cardiometabolic health, right? So that your like heart rate exercising, right? Your cardio, but a lot of them also are building strength and balance, right? If you're carrying a big bag of soil on one hip, that is challenging your balance, right? Like that is part of it. It's why I like hiking. So I hike 3 to 4 miles every morning with my dog, and I'm like, it's building more lower body strength than upper body strength, but it's building strength and it's working on the balance. And then it's also my time in nature. It's my time in my own head. It's, my sunlight for the day, right? It kind of ticks all of those buttons, which are other things, right, that Blue Zone people have in common is much stronger connection to nature, much more time outside, and much stronger communities,
Mm,
much stronger social bonds. And I think um, I think there's a lot of simplification of blue zones as, oh, well, this just means eat a plant-based diet. Um,
no.
Again, I'm more plant forward than plant-based.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of omnivorous diets. And again, only one of the blue zones is actually vegetarian. Um, uh, but I think, it's important to look at the entire societal structure and how all of those things support health. and recognize genetics is still going to be part of the equation, right? There's so much that affects our health that we don't have control over, right? Diet plus lifestyle plus health-related behaviors accounts for 40 to 50% of health outcomes. I think that's worthwhile. I'm gonna do those things, right? That sounds 40 to 50% is great. But there's so much that's outside of our control. And I think it's one of the other like really harmful messages from diet culture is just cut out these three foods, right? Just do this thing and it will cure you. It'll fix list, 50 different health problems. And it maybe it, I mean, yes, diet changes can make a huge difference to a lot of health challenges, but it's not going to be a guarantee. And it's this sort of like health is your personal responsibility message that it is ignoring the other 50 to 60% of things that are affecting our health that we don't have control over.
Mm.
And I think, as somebody who came through restrictive dieting and came through it from a health perspective and from that sort of like health promise place, it's easy to feel defeated when you make a lot of changes that feel really hard and you don't have that whatever was the thing that you were promised. And I think it's like another part of that conversation when we're talking about health versus weight. We're talking about uh, the value of a positive permissive approach over a restrictive one, right? I think the other piece of that is understanding that you can do everything right and still have health problems and still have something
Yep.
terrible to go through health wise. And that doesn't make it your fault. There chance is part of the equation. There's a part of what happens to us health wise that is just a roll of the dice. And I don't think that is um I don't say that to be defeatist. I say that so that we can be empowered to set realistic expectations and look at diet and lifestyle changes from the perspective of long-term health outcomes and setting ourselves up for success in making those healthy habits, right? Because if we look at it uh, as the goal is to make this a way of life, to make it so that this is easy, this is automatic, this is just the way I do it. I have figured out how to fit all of these healthy choices in my day-to-day life and enjoy the foods I'm eating. When I can approach it that way with this like focus on sustainability, I can be liberated from that like urgency, right? So that the do this to fix this is part of that mindset of restriction and fear and it's perfect or bust. When we can give ourselves permission to kind of work on one healthy habit at a time, we're actually increasing the likelihood of, for reals, developing these long-term healthy habits that will improve our health span and lifespan.
I like that you said sustainability
Mhm.
versus that whole yo-yo, I'm on, I'm off, I'm on, I'm off. I in 2022, that's when I really had to figure out what was sustainable for me that supported my health. And
Yeah.
it all related to my metabolic health. So that's a big topic now, because as we all know, metabolic dysfunction and disease is rampant in North
Mhm.
America. So I have to ask you, with the Nutrivore way, how can we support healthy blood sugars and a healthy metabolic body?
Yeah. So, metabolic health is kind of just built in. So, Nutrivore has suggestions rather than guidelines, right? It's very focused on the nutritionally important foods that we can add to our diets rather than anything to take away. So I often refer to Nutrivore as kind of living in between diet and anti-diet. So very focused on healthy eating patterns, but without having to restrict any food. So within those healthy eating patterns, the easiest way to meet our nutritional needs is to choose more whole foods, is to eat lots of fruits and vegetables, which are really important for metabolic health. is to get a few servings of seafood per week, provided, we're not allergic and that aligns with our other dietary priorities. If it doesn't, identifying the nutrients that we were going to get from that seafood that we can't get anywhere else, omega-3 fats, and supplementing accordingly, right? So, um, the within the sort of like broader Nutrivore educational sort of ecosystem, I have a variety of different um, sort of like tools to make it more formulaic for people who really like that, and different tools for different people depending on where they are in their health journey. So, one way would just be to focus on more whole foods, more fruits and vegetables, and higher dietary diversity. That would be a great starting place for a lot of people. Something called the Nutrivore Meal Map, which is sort of crafting a nutritionally balanced plate, very still whole foods focused, still diversity focused, still fruit and vegetable focused, but gives a little bit more structure to each meal. And then I have something called the Nutrivore Weekly Serving Matrix, which gives daily and weekly serving targets for different food families that are nutritionally very important. All of that food focus are all things that improve metabolic health, right? So it's the nutrients that we need for all of those biochemical pathways. It is also, as soon as you focus on whole food sources of carbohydrates, you're focusing on slow burning carbohydrates, right? As soon as you use the Nutrivore Meal Map, you're getting your protein, fiber, slow burning carbs, and healthy fats at each meal. Using the Nutrivore Meal Map, you are getting those foods that have been shown to reduce risk of type 2 diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease. So without having to like get really into counting anything or um, getting obsessive about like what foods I'm eating, all of that is part of the like nutritional sciences like base knowledge that goes into all of the practical resources that I've created. So it's all built in. Reducing cancer risk is built in. Reducing risk of Alzheimer's disease is built in, and it's because it's the same foods, it's the same nutrients that are required for neurological health, as cardiovascular health, as metabolic health, as skeletal health, muscular health, right? Our detoxification systems, digestion, kidneys, right? All of those systems require kind of the same collection of nutrients. So as soon as we focus on those nutrients, we're giving every system what it needs to operate to its best capacity. And so it's the same foods over and over again. You'll see a lot of overlap with how blue zones eat.
Hmm.
It's kind of a lot of the same ideas, right? It's the same science. So yeah, I think eating for metabolic health is not hard, but most of us don't know how. Right. And that is again the both the structure but also like the education that I'm creating with Nutrivore.
I love it. It's perfect. Please let us know, where can we find you? Where can we follow you? We already know your book is called Nutrivore, but
Uh,
let us know.
yeah, so my book Nutrivore is available wherever books are sold and might be at your local library. So if it's not, you can always put in a request with a librarian. My home base is Nutrivore.com. From there, if you click the join button in the top right corner, you'll find a link to my free weekly newsletter and also links to my social media. But I'm at Dr. Sarah Ballantyne on TikTok, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Pinterest. And I post content on all 6 of those platforms every single day, catered to the platform. So different vibes for different places because different things work on different social media platforms. And my entire website, Nutrivore.com, is free to use. So nothing is behind a paywall. There's hundreds of in-depth articles there so that you can start learning about different nutrients and what they do in the body and what foods have what nutrients and all of the nutritionally important foods to focus on some simple additions and easy swaps to get more nutrients.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's such a pleasure having this chat with you today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Perfect. I hit stop there.